Okay, now we're going to start chapter 2. So before we read chapter 2, let's debrief a little. We just went from something fairly normal, right? We went from kids, kind of a little odd for us, actually. Kids don't usually just take a train and go live with a random person in the countryside. But remember, this was set during World War II when the kids had lived in London and it was dangerous there because of the air raids. And so they needed a safe place to stay. And some people in the countryside would allow children to come stay with them, even if it wasn't their, family members. They just said, hey, our place is safe. You can come stay with us. And so that's what was happening. So it's a little odd, but we're talking about, normal world. And then she goes through the wardrobe and suddenly she's in a place where it seems normal until she meets a fawn. And so we're going to do a quick review of a couple of things for this next chapter so you're ready for it. So in chapter 2, we meet the fawn, and this is a picture from the recent movie made about this book. So maybe when we're done reading, you can watch the movie with your family with their permission, with your parents' permission. So there's a picture of the fawn. And one thing that's kind of interesting is this whole story started with C.S. Lewis, the author, imagining this scene. He imagined a fawn in a forest walking with parcels in his hand and an umbrella. And that image drove him to write this story. And he wrote the rest of the story based on this scene. So another thing that's going to come up in chapter 2 is the author mixes different mythological, which are kind of imaginary creatures, into his book. Some of the imaginary creatures he takes from Roman, Greek, or Norse myths. So those would be stories that had been told a long time ago, and they're pretend stories, but they are have these creatures in them. He also took some ideas from Irish and British fairy tales and German folklore. Now, a lot of times when an author writes a fantasy book, they focus on just one genre of fantasy. Like they might just do Greek mythology, or they might just do only Norse mythology. But in one book, they don't normally mix all different kinds, and C.S. Lewis did. So this is something that some people really loved and some people really didn't love about this book. Well, one of the reasons he did this is he grew up in Northern Ireland and he had a nanny who loved to tell him stories. And a lot of the stories she told included giants and other mythological creatures, but he took some of these and just mixed them into the book. So as we come along with these fantasy creatures, just remember C.S. Lewis included them because he used to have StoryTime that included them. All right? So couple that you're going to come across in this specific chapter are naiads and dryads. And those are water spirits are the naiads and dryads are the tree spirits. And again, this is fantasy. This is imagination. And so here we have the fawn, who's this fantastical creature. And we also have, he'll talk about doing things with the naiads and the dryads. So we're talking about these as well. Okay, so now, without further ado, we'll read chapter 2. Chapter 2, What Lucy Found There. Good evening, said Lucy. But the fawn was so busy picking up its parcels that at first it did not reply. When it had finished, it made her a little bow. Good evening, said the fawn. Excuse me, I don't want to be inquisitive, but should I be right in thinking that you are a daughter of Eve? My name's Lucy, she said, not quite understanding him. But forgive me, you are what they call a girl? Asked the fawn. Of course I'm a girl, said Lucy. You are in fact human? Of course I'm human, said Lucy, a little puzzled. To be sure, said the fawn. How stupid of me, but I've never seen a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve before, and I am delighted. That is to say, and then it stopped as if it had been going to say something it had not intended, but it remembered just in time. Delighted, it went on. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Tumnus. I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. And may I ask, O daughter of Eve, said Mr. Tumnus, how have you come into Narnia? Narnia? What's that? Said Lucy. This is the land of Narnia, said the fawn, where we are now, all that lies between the lamppost and the great castle of Cair Paravel on the eastern sea. And you've come from the wild woods of the west? I got in through the wardrobe in the spare room, said Lucy. Ah, Mr. Tumnus said in a rather melancholy voice. If only I had worked harder at geography when I was a little fawn, I should no doubt know all these strange countries. It's too late now. But they aren't countries at all, said Lucy, almost laughing. It's only just back there, at least I'm not sure it's summer there. Meanwhile, said Mr. Tumnus, it's winter in Narnia, and it has been for ever so long. And we shall both catch cold if we stand here talking in the snow. Daughter of Eve, from the far land of Spare and where eternal summer reigns, around the bright city of Wardrobe, how would it be if you came and had tea with me? Thank you very much, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy, but I was wondering whether I ought to be getting back. It's only just around the corner, said the fawn, and there'll be a roaring fire, and toast and sardines, and cake. Well, it is very kind of you, said Lucy, but I shan't be able to stay long. So we have a picture of the two of them walking off in the forest together. If you will take my arm, daughter of Eve, said Mr. Tumnus, I shall be able to hold the umbrella over both of us. That's the way. Now off we go. And so Lucy found herself walking through the wood arm in arm with this strange creature as if they had known one another their whole lives. They had not gone far before they came to a place where the ground became rough and there were little rocks all around and little hills up and little hills down. And at the bottom of one small valley, Mr. Tumnus turned suddenly aside as if he were going to walk straight into an unusually large rock. But at the last moment, Lucy found he was leading her into the entrance of the cave. As soon as they were inside, she found herself blinking in the light of a wood fire. Then Mr. Tumnus stooped and took a flaming piece of wood out of the fire with a neat little pair of tongs and lit the lamp. Now we shan't be long, he said, and he immediately put the kettle on. Lucy thought she'd never been in a nicer place. It was a little dry, clean cave of reddish stone, with a carpet on the floor and two little chairs. One for me and one for a friend, said Mr. Tumnus, and a table and a dresser and a mantelpiece over the fire, and above that a picture of an old fawn with a gray beard. In one corner there was a door that Lucy thought must lead to Mr. Tumnus's bedroom, and on one wall was a shelf full of books. Lucy looked at these things while he was setting out the tea things. They had titles like The Life and Letters of Selenius, or Nymphs and Their Ways, or Men, Monks and Gamekeepers, a Study in Popular Legend, or Is Man a Myth? Now, daughter of Eve, said the fawn, and really it was a wonderful tea. There was a nice little brown egg, lightly boiled, for each of them, and sardines on toast, and then buttered toast, and then toast with honey, and then a sugar-topped cake. Now, she says it's a nice tea. Just remember, in England, tea is a small meal they have in the mid-afternoon, maybe about 4 o'clock. Then the fawn began to talk. He had wonderful tales of to tell of life of the forest. He told about the midnight dances, about how the nymphs who lived in the wells and the dryads who lived in the trees came out to dance with the fawns. He told about long hunting parties after the milk-white stag who could give you wishes if you caught him. He told stories about feasting and treasure-seeking with the wild, wet, red dwarfs in the deep mines and caverns far beneath the forest floor. And then about summer, when the woods were green and old Selenius on his fat donkey would come and visit them, and sometimes Bacchus himself, and streams would run with wine instead of water, and the whole forest would give itself up to jollification for weeks on end, meaning having fun. Okay, here's a picture of his house. You can see he's sitting in his armchair. Lucy's in this armchair, and they've got a fire, the tea things. And then this shows the fun he was talking about. He's talking about dancing with the naiads and the dryads and hunting the white stag. And if you caught him, he would give you wishes. And about all the fun they're having. So he's contrasting that now, and he says, Not that it isn't always winter now, he added gloomily. Then, to cheer himself up, he took out from a case on a dresser a little flute. It looked as if it were made of straw, and he began to play. The tune he played made Lucy want to cry and laugh and dance and go to sleep all at the same time. It must have been hours later when she shook herself and said, Mr. Tumnus, I'm so sorry to stop you, and I do love that tune, but really, I must go home. I only meant to stay for a few minutes. It's no good now, you know, said the fawn, laying its flute down and shaking its head at her very sorrowfully. No good, said Lucy, jumping up and feeling rather frightened. What do you mean? I've got to go home at once. The others will be wondering what has happened to me. But a moment later she said, Mr. Tumnus, whatever is the matter? For the fawn's brown eyes had filled with tears, and the tears began to trickle down its cheeks, and soon they were running off its face, off the end of its nose, and at last it covered its face with its hands and began to howl. Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy in great distress, don't, what's the matter? Aren't you well? Dear Mr. Tumnus, do tell me what's wrong. But the fawn continued sobbing, and as if his heart would break. And even when Lucy went over and put her arms around him and lent him her handkerchief, he did not stop. He merely took the handkerchief and kept on using it, wringing it out with both hands whenever it got too wet to be of any more use, so that presently Lucy was standing in a damp patch. There's Mr. Tumnus. Mr. Tumnus, bawled Lucy in his ear, shaking him, do stop it at once. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. A great big fawn like you, whatever on earth are you crying about? Oh, sobbed Mr. Tumnus. I'm crying because I'm such a bad fawn. I don't think you're a bad fawn at all, said Lucy. I think you're a very good fawn. You are the nicest fawn I've met. Now, doesn't that kind of make you laugh a little? Because probably the first fawn she's ever met. Oh, you wouldn't say that if you knew, replied Mr. Tumnus between his sobs. No, I'm a bad fawn. I don't suppose there was ever a worse fawn since the beginning of the world. But what have you done? Asked Lucy. My old father now, said Mr. Tumnus. That's his picture over the mantelpiece. He would never have done a thing like this. A thing like what? Said Lucy. Like what I've done, said the fawn. Taken service under the White Witch. That's what I am. I'm in the pay of the White Witch. The White Witch? Who is she? Why, she's got all of Narnia under her thumb, and that's what makes it always winter. Always winter and never Christmas. Think of that. How awful, said Lucy. But what does she pay you for? That's the worst of it, said Mr. Tumnus. With a deep groan, I'm a kidnapper for her. That's what I am. Look at me, daughter of Eve. Would you believe I'm the sort of fawn to meet a poor, innocent child in the wood, one that had never done me any harm, and pretend to be friendly with it, and invite it home to my cave, all for the sake of lulling it to sleep and then handing it over to the White Witch? No, said Lucy, I'm sure you wouldn't do that. Anything of the sort. Well, I have, said the fawn. Well, said Lucy very slowly, for she wanted to be truthful and yet not be too hard on him. Well, that was pretty bad, but you're sorry for it, and I'm sure you'll never do it again. Daughter of Eve, don't you understand, said the fawn. It isn't something I have done. I'm doing it now this very moment. What do you mean? Cried Lucy, turning very white. You're the child, said Tumnus. I had orders from the White Witch that if I ever saw a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve in the wood, I was to catch them and hand them over to her. And you are the first one I've ever met. And I've pretended to be your friend and asked you to tea, and all the time I've been meaning to wait till you were asleep and then go tell her. Oh, but you won't, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. You won't, will you? Indeed, you really mustn't. And if I don't, said he, beginning to cry again, she's sure to find out, and she'll have my tail cut off, and my horn sawn off, and my beard plucked out, and she'll wave her wand over my beautiful cloven hoofs and turn them into horrid solid hoofs like a wretched horse's. And if she's extra especially angry, she'll turn me into stone. And then I shall only be a statue of a fawn in her horrible house until the 4 thrones at Cair Paravel are filled, and goodness knows when that will happen, or whether it will ever happen at all. I'm so very sorry, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy, but please, please let me go home. Of course I will, said the fawn. Of course I've got to, I see that now. I hadn't known what humans were like before. I met you, of course I can't give you up to the witch. Not now that I know you. But we must be off at once. We'll see you back to the lamppost. I suppose you can find your own way from there back to Spare and Wardrobe? I'm sure I can, said Lucy. We must go as quietly as we can, said Mr. Tumnus. The whole world is filled with her spies. Even some of the trees are on her side. You can see him sneaking through the forest there. They both got up and left the tea things on the table, and Mr. Tumnus once more put his umbrella out and gave Lucy his arm, and they went out into the snow. The journey's back was not at all like the journey to the fawn's cave. They stole along as quickly as they could, without speaking a word, and Mr. Tumnus kept to the darkest places. Lucy was relieved when they reached the lamppost again. Do you know your way from here, daughter of Eve? said Tumnus. Lucy looked very hard between the trees and could just see in the distance a patch of light that looked like daylight. Yes, she said, I can see the wardrobe door. Then be off home as quick as you can, said the fawn. And can you ever forgive me for what I meant to do? Why, of course I can, said Lucy, shaking him heartily by the hand, and I do hope you won't get into dreadful trouble on my account. Farewell, daughter of Eve, said he. Perhaps may I keep the handkerchief? Rather, said Lucy, then ran toward the far-off patch of daylight as quickly as her legs would carry her, and presently, instead of rough branches brushing past her, she felt coats, and instead of crunching snow, under her feet she felt wooden boards, and all at once she found herself jumping out of the wardrobe into the same empty room from which the whole adventure started. She shut the wardrobe door tightly behind her and looked around, panting for breath. It was still raining, and she could hear voices of the others in the passage. I'm here, she shouted. I'm here, I've come back, I'm all right. And that's the end of chapter 2. Now, one thing I forgot to mention before we read it is the reference of son of Adam and daughter of Eve. Now, knowing that you're connected to Royal Palms Baptist Church somehow, if you're watching this, hopefully you've learned about the creation and how God created Adam and Eve as the first humans on earth. And when Mr. Tumnus is calling her daughter of Eve, it doesn't mean she's Eve's daughter. It doesn't mean like literally. It's saying she's in the human race, okay? Because all of us came from Adam and Eve, but way back. And so when he calls her that or says, I'm looking for sons of Adam and daughters of Eve, it doesn't mean they're literal children. It just means humankind. So I should have clarified that beforehand. All right, they left us on a cliffhanger. What do you think the other kids will say now that she tells them the story of having been in this land called Narnia? Let's make a little prediction, make a guess, tell your parents. And after we read the next chapter, we'll see what happens.